Picture this. You're a servant in a Hungarian castle in the year 1610, and you've just been summoned to prepare your mistress's evening bath. But as you climb the stone steps to her private chambers, the metallic stench hits you like a physical blow. Your hands shake as you push open the heavy wooden door, and there she sits, the most beautiful woman in all of Hungary, submerged in a bathtub filled not with water, not with milk, not with rose petals, the most beautiful woman in all of Hungary, submerged in a bathtub filled not with water, not with milk, not with rose petals. This is Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, a woman so consumed by vanity and terror of aging that she convinced herself human blood was the secret to eternal youth. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of medieval madness. It's the story of how absolute power, combined with desperate narcissism, can transform a human being into something that defies every natural law of decency and compassion. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Now, you might think you know this story. You might have heard whispers about the Blood Countess who bathed in virgin blood. But what you haven't heard is the psychological horror behind those baths. The systematic torture chambers hidden beneath her castle floors. The servants who disappeared one by one until entire villages lived in terror of her name. Most disturbing of all, you haven't heard about how she convinced herself that every act of cruelty was actually an act of self-preservation, that every drop of innocent blood was a medicine prescribed by fate itself. Elizabeth Bathory wasn't born a monster. She was born into one of the most powerful families in 16th century Hungary, a world where noble blood meant everything and peasant blood meant nothing. Her family tree was decorated with warriors, politicians, and yes, more than a few sadists who had turned cruelty into an art form. But Elizabeth would surpass them all, transforming from a beautiful young noble woman into something that would make her ancestors look like saints. The year was 1560 when Elizabeth first drew breath in the fortress of Nyírbátor. Even as an infant, she possessed an otherworldly beauty that would become both her greatest weapon and her most dangerous obsession. Her skin was porcelain white, her eyes the color of winter ice, her hair like spun gold that caught sunlight and held it captive. People would travel for miles just to glimpse the child who looked like she had been carved by angels. But beauty in 16th century Hungary came with a terrible price. Elizabeth learned early that her appearance was her currency, her power, her very identity. In a world where women were valued primarily for their looks and their ability to produce heirs, she understood that aging wasn't just inevitable decline. It was social death, political irrelevance, the end of everything that made her matter. As she grew from child to young woman, Elizabeth became increasingly obsessed with mirrors. She would spend hours studying every angle of her face, memorizing each curve and contour, searching for the first signs of time's assault on her perfection. Castle servants whispered that she owned more mirrors than the rest of Hungary combined, that her chambers were lined with polished silver and glass that reflected her image back at her from every possible direction. But mirrors, as Elizabeth would discover, are cruel companions. They show you not just what you are, but what you're becoming. And what Elizabeth saw beginning to emerge in her early 20s sent her into spirals of panic that would shape the rest of her blood-soaked life. It started with a single gray hair, discovered on the morning of her 23rd birthday. Elizabeth stood before her favorite mirror, the one crafted by Venetian artisans and framed in gold, when she spotted it. One silver strand among the gold, barely visible, but undeniably real. The discovery sent her into such a rage that she destroyed half the furniture in her chamber, screaming at servants and demanding to know. If they had seen it too, if they had been laughing at her behind her back. That night, she cut the offending hair with a ceremonial dagger that had belonged to her grandfather, a warrior who had slaughtered Turkish invaders by the hundreds. As the silver strand fell to the floor, Elizabeth made a vow that would echo through the centuries. She would never age. She would never lose her beauty. Whatever it took, whatever price had to be paid, she would remain young and perfect forever. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with small cruelties, tiny experiments in power and pain that most people would have dismissed as the ordinary callousness of nobility. A servant girl slapped for moving too slowly, a kitchen maid beaten for dropping a plate, a seamstress whipped for pricking Elizabeth's finger during a fitting. These weren't unusual punishments by the standards of the time. Noble families had always treated their servants harshly, and no one thought to question Elizabeth's increasingly violent outbursts. But for Elizabeth, these moments of cruelty served a different purpose. She began to notice something that would change the course of her life and doom hundreds of innocent girls to unimaginable deaths. When she struck her servants, when she watched them cry and bleed and beg for mercy, she felt something she had never experienced before. A rush of power so intoxicating, so addictive, that it made her feel truly alive for the first time in her privileged existence. More importantly, she convinced herself that she looked younger afterward. After each act of violence, each display of absolute power over another human being, Elizabeth would rush to her mirrors and study her reflection with scientific precision. The stress lines around her eyes seemed softer. The tiny wrinkles at the corners of her mouth appeared less pronounced. Her skin glowed with what she believed was renewed vitality. It was madness, of course. The temporary flush of excitement and adrenaline that came from exercising power over helpless victims created a brief illusion of youth and vigor. But Elizabeth's desperate mind seized on this correlation and transformed it into causation. Violence didn't just make her feel younger. It actually was making her younger. This delusion would grow and metastasize over the following months until Elizabeth developed a complete theory of how cruelty could reverse the aging process. She began studying ancient texts about blood magic and youth potions, consulting with traveling mystics and hedge witches who claimed to know the secrets of eternal life. Slowly, methodically, she constructed an elaborate mythology around her own beauty and the lengths she would go to preserve it. But the real breakthrough came on a winter evening in 1585, when Elizabeth was 25 years old and beginning to panic about the subtle changes that time was working on her face. She had been beating a young servant girl for some minor infraction when her ring caught the girl's cheek, opening a deep gash that sent blood spattering across Elizabeth's pale hand. As she wiped the crimson drops from her skin, Elizabeth noticed something that would seal the fate of hundreds of innocent victims. Where the blood had touched her hand, her skin seemed to glow with renewed vitality. The veins appeared less prominent, the texture smoother, the overall appearance somehow more youthful and vibrant. Standing there in her chamber, blood-spattered and trembling with a mixture of excitement and terror, Elizabeth Bathory made a discovery that would transform her from a vain, noble woman into one of history as most notorious serial killers. The secret to eternal youth wasn't hidden in ancient potions or magical rituals. It was flowing through the veins of every young girl in her domain, waiting to be harvested. That night, Elizabeth dismissed all her servants except for one old woman named Dorothea Shontis, a crone who had served the Bathory family for decades and whose loyalty was matched only by her complete moral flexibility. In the flickering candlelight of Elizabeth's private chambers, a countess shared her revelation with the one person she trusted to help her pursue it. Dorothea listened with the practiced patience of someone who had spent years enabling the whims of the powerful. When Elizabeth finished explaining her theory about blood and youth, the old woman simply nodded and asked a single chilling question. How many girls would her mistress need? The first victim was a peasant girl named Anna, barely 14 years old, who had been brought to the castle to work in the kitchens. She was everything Elizabeth had once been and feared she was losing. Young, beautiful, with skin so smooth and unmarked by time that it seemed to glow in the torchlight. Elizabeth told herself that Anna should be grateful for the honor of contributing to something greater than her miserable peasant existence. The killing took place in Elizabeth's private bath chamber, a room that had been designed for luxury, but would soon be transformed into something resembling a medieval operating theater. Elizabeth had Anna bound to a wooden chair while she carefully positioned a silver basin beneath the girl's throat. She wanted to collect every precious drop, to ensure that none of the life-giving essence would be wasted on the stone floor. The first cut was tentative, almost experimental. Elizabeth had never killed anyone before, and despite her growing sadism, she wasn't prepared for the reality of watching a human being die by her own hand. Anna's eyes went wide with terror and confusion. She tried to speak, to beg for her life, but the words came out as desperate gurgles as blood filled her throat. Elizabeth found herself mesmerized by the sight. The crimson liquid flowing from Anna's neck was warm and thick, with a metallic scent that filled the chamber and seemed to coat everything it touched. But more than that, Elizabeth felt an overwhelming sense of power as she watched the light fade from the girl's eyes. Here was the ultimate expression of her nobility, her right to take whatever she needed from those beneath her station. When Anna's body finally went limp, Elizabeth carefully poured the collected blood into her marble bathtub. She had expected it to feel warm against her skin, perhaps tingle with some mysterious energy that would immediately restore her youth. Instead, the blood was merely blood, cooling rapidly and leaving sticky red stains on everything it touched. But Elizabeth refused to be discouraged. If one girl wasn't enough, then she would need more. Perhaps the magic required larger quantities, or maybe young blood had to be mixed in specific proportions. She began treating her quest for eternal youth like a scientific experiment, with each new victim providing data for her increasingly elaborate theories. The second killing came only 3 days later. This time Elizabeth chose Maria, a servant girl who had been working in the castle's laundry. Elizabeth had noticed how Maria's hands remained soft despite the harsh lye soap she worked with daily, and she convinced herself that this girl's blood might be particularly potent for preserving skin. Maria's death was more violent than Anna's. Elizabeth had grown impatient with the slow process of bleeding out, so she used a razor to open multiple wounds simultaneously. The girl's screams echoed through the stone corridors until Dorothea stuffed rags into her mouth to muffle the sound. When it was over, Elizabeth had collected nearly twice as much blood as before. This time, when she lowered herself into the crimson bath, Elizabeth felt something she interpreted as success. The blood was still warm from Maria's body, and as it covered her skin, she experienced a rush of sensation that she mistook for magical transformation. Her reflection in the water seemed younger, more vibrant, as if the girl's life force was already beginning to work its restoration. The warmth of the blood and the excitement of her successful kill had brought color to Elizabeth's cheeks and brightness to her eyes. The warmth of the blood and the excitement of her successful kill had brought color to Elizabeth's cheeks and brightness to her eyes. The warmth of the blood and the excitement of her successful kill had brought color to Elizabeth's cheeks and brightness to her eyes. Word of the missing girls began to spread through the surrounding villages, but slowly and with the kind of resigned acceptance that characterized peasant life in feudal Hungary. Servant girls disappeared all the time, running off to marry or seek better opportunities, or simply dying from the countless diseases and accidents that claimed the poor with depressing regularity. A few families asked questions, but Elizabeth's steward dismissed their concerns with vague explanations about girls being sent to work at other estates. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was refining her technique. She discovered that younger girls provided what she believed to be more potent blood, so she began specifically targeting victims between the ages of 12 and 16. She also noticed that fear seemed to affect the quality of the blood, making it somehow less effective for her purposes. So she developed methods of killing that would minimize her victim's terror. This led to the construction of what Elizabeth called her beauty chambers, a series of rooms beneath the castle that were specifically designed for her blood harvesting activities. The main chamber contained an ornate bathtub carved from black marble, surrounded by drainage channels that would carry excess blood away from the bathing area. Specialized restraints were built into the walls, designed to hold victims in positions that would allow for efficient blood collection while minimizing mess and noise. Adjacent rooms served different purposes in Elizabeth's expanding operation. One contained beds where victims could be kept before their deaths, allowing Elizabeth to select the perfect moment for each killing based on astrological charts and her own superstitious calculations. Another room housed a growing collection of implements she used for torture and murder, each tool carefully maintained and organized according to its specific purpose. But perhaps most disturbing was the room Elizabeth called her laboratory, where she began experimenting with different methods of preparing and preserving blood for maximum effectiveness. She tried heating it to different temperatures, mixing it with various herbs and oils, even attempting to distill it into concentrated essences that could be stored for future use. The room reeked of death and decay, but Elizabeth had convinced herself that these were the sweet odors of scientific progress. As her confidence grew, so did her appetite for victims. As her confidence grew, so did her appetite for victims. Elizabeth developed a network of accomplices who would scout the surrounding countryside for suitable targets, looking for girls whose disappearances wouldn't attract too much attention from authorities. The selection process became increasingly ritualized. Elizabeth would personally examine each potential victim, studying their skin, hair, and overall health with the focused attention of a livestock breeder evaluating prize animals. Girls with blemishes or scars were rejected as unsuitable for her purposes. Only the most perfect specimens were deemed worthy of contributing to her quest for eternal beauty. The psychological transformation that accompanied Elizabeth's escalating murders was perhaps more horrifying than the physical acts themselves. The psychological transformation that accompanied Elizabeth's escalating murders was perhaps more horrifying than the physical acts themselves. The Countess began to see herself as a goddess of beauty, chosen by fate to transcend the natural limitations that bound ordinary mortals to aging and decay. Her servants noticed the change immediately. Where once Elizabeth had been demanding but predictable, she now moved through the castle with an otherworldly confidence that bordered on madness. She would glide through corridors speaking to reflections that others couldn't see, holding conversations with mirrors about the remarkable improvements in her complexion and the renewed vitality coursing through her veins. The bloodbaths had evolved from desperate experiments into elaborate ceremonies that consumed entire days. Elizabeth would fast for 24 hours before each ritual, believing that an empty stomach would allow her body to better absorb the life-giving properties of virgin blood. She commissioned special chalices made from silver and adorned with precious stones, claiming that drinking blood from common vessels would contaminate its magical properties. The preparation ritual began at sunset, with Elizabeth as remaining loyal servants, carefully heating the collected blood to what she determined was the optimal temperature for youth restoration. Too hot, and she believed the life essence would be destroyed. Too cold, and the blood wouldn't properly penetrate her skin to work its transformative magic. She had convinced herself, through months of experimentation, that the perfect temperature was exactly that of a living human body, warm enough to feel alive against her skin, but not so hot as to cause discomfort. As she lowered herself into each crimson bath, Elizabeth would recite incantations she had learned from the occult texts in her private library. Ancient Hungarian phrases mixed with Latin prayers created a horrifying symphony that echoed through the stone chambers. She truly believed that these words would enhance the blood's power, directing its essence toward the specific areas of her body that needed the most rejuvenation. But the most disturbing aspect of Elizabeth's transformation was how she had begun to view her victims not as human beings, but as living vessels of the commodity she desperately needed. In her twisted mind, peasant girls existed solely to provide the raw materials for her beauty treatments. Their lives had no value beyond the blood that flowed through their veins, and their deaths were simply the necessary cost of maintaining her divine perfection. The killing methods became increasingly elaborate as Elizabeth's confidence grew. Simple throat cutting had evolved into complex torture sessions designed to maximize both blood collection and her own psychological satisfaction. She discovered that terror and pain seemed to affect the quality of blood, though whether this made it more or less effective for her purposes remained a subject of constant experimentation. She discovered that terror and pain seemed to affect the quality of blood, though whether this made it more or less effective for her purposes remained a subject of constant experimentation. Elizabeth would sit beneath them in her marble tub, letting the crimson drops fall directly onto her skin while she meditated on her growing power over life and death. Other girls were strapped to specially designed tables that tilted at precise angles to ensure complete blood drainage. Their final moments spent watching the Countess prepare for another rejuvenating bath. The psychological impact on the surrounding region was devastating. Entire villages lived in constant fear that their daughters might be selected for Elizabeth's horrific experiments. Families began hiding their most beautiful girls, sending them away to distant relatives, or even disguising them as boys to avoid attracting the Countess's attention. The very mention of Castle Sigit was enough to send mothers into hysterics, and fathers reaching for whatever weapons they could find. Yet the local authorities seemed powerless to intervene. Elizabeth's family connections protected her from most legal consequences, and the few officials brave enough to investigate her activities found themselves facing pressure from powerful nobles who preferred to look the other way. The Bathory name carried enormous weight in Hungarian politics, and few were willing to risk their careers by accusing a countess of multiple murders based on the testimony of terrified peasants. Elizabeth interpreted this lack of interference as confirmation of her divine status. Surely, if the authorities had any real power over her, they would have acted by now. Their silence proved that she had transcended normal human law, that her quest for eternal beauty had elevated her beyond the reach of ordinary justice. She was becoming something greater than human, something that existed outside the moral constraints that governed lesser beings. The end came suddenly, as it often does for those who believe themselves untouchable. In December of 1610, a group of soldiers and investigators arrived at Castle Sigit without warning, acting on orders from King Matthias himself. They had come to investigate reports of missing girls and the strange activities rumored to be taking place in the Countess's private chambers. What they discovered exceeded their darkest expectations. The beauty chambers beneath the castle were a charnel house of human remains and torture devices. What they discovered exceeded their darkest expectations. The beauty chambers beneath the castle were a charnel house of human remains and torture devices. The marble bathtub was stained permanently red, and the drainage channels were clogged with congealed blood and human tissue. Elizabeth herself was found in her private chambers, preparing for what would have been her final bloodbath. She showed no shame or remorse when confronted with evidence of her crimes, instead expressing outrage that anyone would dare interrupt her sacred rituals. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong. She had simply claimed what was rightfully hers as a member of the nobility, using the lives of worthless peasants to achieve something magnificent and divine. The trial that followed was a mockery of justice, designed more to protect the reputation of Hungary as noble families than to seek truth or provide closure for the victims' families. Elizabeth was never allowed to testify in her own defense, instead being condemned to life imprisonment in a sealed chamber within her own castle. The official record stated that she had killed over 600 young women, though investigators believed the true number was likely much higher. For the final 4 years of her life, Elizabeth Bathory lived in complete isolation, sealed inside a room with no windows and only small openings for food and waste removal. She died in 1614 at the age of 54, her quest for eternal youth having brought her nothing but infamy and a lonely death. The irony was perfect and terrible. In her desperate attempt to remain forever young and beautiful, she had transformed herself into something so monstrous that even death seemed like a mercy. The legacy of the Blood Countess serves as a chilling reminder of what happens when vanity and power combine with complete moral bankruptcy. Elizabeth Bathory, as story reveals, the terrifying depths of human cruelty that can emerge when someone convinces themselves that their desires justify any action, no matter how horrific. Her blood-soaked baths were never about achieving immortality. They were about a woman so consumed by narcissism that she was willing to destroy hundreds of innocent lives rather than accept the simple truth that all beauty fades, all youth passes, and all human beings must eventually confront their own mortality. In the end, Elizabeth achieved a form of immortality, but not the kind she sought. Her name lives on not as a symbol of eternal beauty, but as a warning about the monstrous lengths to which human vanity can drive us. The peasant girls whose blood she stole in pursuit of youth are forgotten, their names lost to history. But the Blood Countess herself remains, forever frozen in infamy as one of history's most prolific serial killers, her quest for physical immortality having earned her only the eternal condemnation of human memory.